Hello and welcome back to day 3 of KeyShot World 2020. This is session 2. I'm your host, Derek Cicero. Thank you again for joining us. As always, you can follow along on the Zoom or on our YouTube live stream. Reminder I wanted to say today, I mentioned this yesterday, but if you're working from home and you need access to a KeyShot license, please contact your sales representative. If you need any help working from home on KeyShot, or if you don't know who that is, you can go to sales@luxion.com. Also want to thank the folks at Dosh Design. If you go on our website and you go through the agenda, there's a section there that says exclusive content. One of the things it has on there is the Animation Essentials content that Will is providing today, so you can download that, as well as Dosh Design has provided really high quality HDRIs on scenes on there. It's 2.2 gigabytes. So you heard me correctly, 2.2 gigabytes. So thank you very much, Dosh Design. Again, go to the agenda section, exclusive content, download that. In case you missed it, earlier today, our first presentation was building and managing your digital twin with Brad Edelman and Tim Fair from KeyShot Studios. It was a great presentation focused on single asset reuse and the concept of, you create it once in KeyShot and then you can use it everywhere, across sales, across marketing, across all levels of production. So if you didn't see it, I really recommend it. It's a fantastic presentation. For those that don't know, KeyShot Studios, where Brad and Tim are from, launched earlier this year. It's led by industry veterans, Tim and Brad. It's headquartered in Detroit. It's a full service shop, so if you have any KeyShot visualization needs, the folks at KeyShot Studios can help you out. If you want more information, you can go to KeyShotStudios.com to follow up about them or their services. Coming up next today, we've got Animation Essentials from Part to Material with Will Gibbons. Many KeyShot users probably already know Will Gibbons from his many online videos. Will previously worked at Luxion for years before starting his own firm, Will Gibbons Design. And he's doing product animation and renderings for customers such as Peloton and Vizio. And so if you don't know where to start with KeyShot animation, you're kind of new to it, this is going to be great. If you're someone who's done animations before, but maybe you don't kind of know all the different elements of it, this is going to be great. Long story short, you're in great hands with Will. It's going to be a fantastic presentation. And thank you, Will, for coming and doing it for us. Reminder, as always, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you have a question for Will regarding what you're seeing, you can ask that anytime, and we'll kind of group those up and ask Will at the end of that. In addition, if you're interested in animation, there's also an advanced animation techniques class. Ryan Levy's hosting that 10 a.m. this Friday. So you have today's session and you'll have Ryan's session as well. So a lot of opportunity this week to really work on your KeyShot animation skills. So yeah, let's get started here. One last thing, we do have a giveaway today. GoPro has provided us with a Hero 7 camera. So at the end of the Q&A, we'll be giving that GoPro camera away. Thank you again, GoPro. There's so many giveaways, right? We got cameras, we got rendering, we got Dosh Design. It's just fantastic. Reminder, follow us on social media, hashtag KeyShot World. Follow us on Render Weekly on Instagram for the render contest. Just so much happening. All right, hey, with that, let's get started. Will Gibbons, Animation Essentials from Part to Material. Will, take it away.
All right, thanks, Derek. Hopefully I'm coming in nice and clear. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can I get confirmation that you're seeing KeyShot right now?
Confirmed.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to tab on over to my presentation here. First of all, thanks for everybody who's joining from all over the place. It's really cool that we can connect like this. So hopefully you get to learn everything you wanted to know about the basics of animation, and then maybe a little bit more. A little bit about myself before we start. If we haven't met before, my name is Will Gibbons. I live outside of LA, but that's kind of the nearest large city, so we'll go with that. I'm a visualization specialist, which does not roll off the tongue, which is why I have to say that I make videos and images of products that are often used for promotion. But I try to really bring my background of design into what I do to try to create images that are really satisfying. So I personally think that everyone should try to create product images that make someone want something or elicit desire. That's kind of my short summary of what I try to do. And as a secondary, if I can, I really want to still tell the story behind a product. So I think there's a lot of work and care and attention that goes into the products that get designed and sold all around the world. And when a client comes to me asking to create some bit of promotional piece for them, these are my goals. I want to make images that make someone want their product, but also to tell the story and really connect with the intended audience. So that's what I'm always trying to do, whether it's a still image or an animated piece. And those are just some things to kind of keep in mind as you work into your animations here. Last thing I'll point out is I do have a website. It's just my name, willgibbons.com. And when you go there, you can learn a bunch more about KeyShot. I mean, obviously KeyShot has a bunch of great learning resources, but I try to do my best to give back to the community that's given a lot to me. So on my website, there's a ton of free resources that you may want to check out in your own time. As we get into this though, I want to quickly roll a demo reel so you can see some of the work I've produced. You can kind of get an understanding of where we're going with this presentation.
Just so you know, it's still showing your KeyShot screen at this point.
Oh, well, look at that. Thank you so much. My goodness. Let me go ahead and switch because it looks like it did not switch applications. That is my bad. How about this? Are we seeing a picture of my ugly mug?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
All right. Okay, man. Thanks for stopping me there. I really appreciate it, Derek. Technology. Okay, so again, this is all information that's available in the downloads as well. So I'm going to go onto my next slide here and run this demo reel, and hopefully we get some audio with this too. Definitely not something I'm hearing. You know what? Imagine some really cool audio, maybe. Maybe we can do that. I'm going to go ahead and let this roll. I'm sorry, guys, but yeah, we'll see how this goes. All right, so since there was no audio with that, the next animation here I'm going to show you really quickly. Oh, there was a link to it right there. I'm actually going to just go ahead and pop right into that here. Sorry about that. I'm going to go ahead and check this out. And hopefully we are now seeing one more video, and I'm going to go ahead and let this roll, and there should be audio this time. Okay, so once again, sorry about that, but I was hoping to just go ahead and give you again a taste of some of the work that I do. The second animation that I played there that was not muted, that's what we're going to be digging into today. I have that model, I made that available, and we're going to be using that as an example. So the rest of the presentation I'm going to run through is kind of organized in the starting point, which is basically adding and editing your animations, and then managing, which gets into making adjustments to them, as well as kind of organization and workflow. When we get into fine tuning, I'm talking about kind of that last 10%. How do we make those kind of micro adjustments or add a little bit more dynamic movement to really make the animation more interesting? And then I'll touch on importing animations briefly. I'm not going to do a lot of that because I know Ryan is going to be doing some of that on Friday as well. So before I proceed, I'm going to check in one more time, make sure that we are on the right. You're seeing what I'm seeing. It looks like we're good. Okay, so adding and editing our animations. The first thing I want to talk about is our timeline. So in KeyShot, the timeline is where everything happens. This is where all of our animations live. So I'm going to tab on over to KeyShot, and I'm realizing now I'm going to have to switch here. Sorry about that. Okay, so inside KeyShot, our timeline is going to be at the bottom. If this layout of KeyShot looks kind of intimidating or confusing, let me give you a quick tour. On the left-hand side, I've got our typical library of materials, colors, textures, environments, that type of thing. We've got the project panel over here on the right-hand side, the real-time view here in the middle. And then I'd like to have my studios as its own column further to the right, and we will get into studios here in a bit. And lastly, the geometry view on the far right. And I actually tend to kind of split my workspace where I'm using the geometry view quite a bit to move things around, but I'm keeping the real-time view as my active viewport so I can understand where my camera, what my camera's seeing and what the light looks like. Now, the timeline, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be across the bottom. So if I click on this little animation timeline button or simply hit A on the keyboard, that brings up our timeline. So our animations are going to live in this timeline. And let's go ahead and see what else we have here. All right. So the frames per second, I'm going to talk about, as well as setting our spacebar to play. And yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So back on over into KeyShot. We're going to go ahead and see this FPS value right here. It's set to 30. So I want to call this out real quick because this number can be changed, but if you're not aware of what it does, it could have a big impact on what you get in the end. This is the number of frames you're going to render, or still images KeyShot will have to render for every second of video that you produce. If you're on a machine where you are struggling to get your animation done in time, or you really want to conserve resources, running this at 24 is going to give you that kind of cinematic or TV type feel, where it's going to be the frame rate that is commonly used on motion picture films, whereas 30 is going to be more for digital content these days. Anything higher than that, you're getting into video that you would use to slow things down, but again, is a little bit overkill. So changing that and setting it to whatever value you want. I do like 30 if you can afford it, because it gives you the ability to slow things down a little bit in post-production if needed. And lastly, when we create an animation, so I talked about setting your preferences to change your spacebar to play. I do know that I go into preferences and we look at our hotkeys. And if I search for play, pause under animation, mine is set to space on the keyboard. I think it's defaulted to something different, but if you are fighting muscle memory from another application, just know that KeyShot does allow for customizing of that command, which is really cool. All right, so let's actually get into building some animations. So part animations are going to be what we use to control individual pieces of geometry, or parts or models. And the concept is that we're going to layer simple transforms, and a transform is just moving a part from one place to another. And then we are going to take advantage of things like global and local axes whenever we can. So if I get on into KeyShot, let's go ahead and do this. Okay, so we want to go ahead and create a simple animation. Here's our model. We've got a little cord. I'm going to hide this cord for now because it is a little distracting. And I'm going to hide my model sets for a second here. So I'll just go ahead and close that. And inside my wireless router model, I'm going to turn off the power cable. And you can see I've got very basic materials set up at this point. Now, we could go into full screen here with our real-time view. However, I know I'm going to render this out at a 16:9, so I want to maintain that aspect ratio. But to give us some more real estate on the screen, I'll close my library panel. There we go. So we have an internet router or a wireless router with a bunch of lights, and then the IO panel on the back. And I've got a basic kind of an aluminum metal finish here. And I think for our environment, I just have a plain old startup environment at first. So let's go ahead and start creating some simple animations, and then we'll get into making this look cooler with some more dynamic lighting and stuff like that. So to create a part animation, you've got a couple ways. We can click on our animation wizard. If you're new to animation, this is where I suggest you start. So we can go ahead and start with a translation. This is going to be the simplest and probably the most commonly used animation, where you move a part from point A to point B. We'll go ahead and hit next, and let's start with just moving our entire router up off of the ground. And we're going to grab the entire wireless router and go ahead and hit next. And then we can translate this. Default is Y and 1. And if you go to scrub along the timeline or play this, you'll notice it doesn't look like it's moving. And that's because this value is whatever our units, our scene is set to. If I were to go to the scene tree, I'll see that my size is in millimeters. So 1 in the Y direction is only 1 millimeter. So let's set it to 150, which is about half of a foot. And now it moves up off the ground. It moves up because I dragged the playhead to the end of this animation. So to save yourself some time, when you add an animation, drag this little guy to the right, and you're going to see the part move, and then you'll see where it's going to end up. And then we're not surprised after the fact. Now, I talked about local axis versus global. In this case, it's not going to change for these two, but your axis orientation comes in down here. We'll talk about that on a separate part. For now, I'm going to leave the rest of these settings as they are and just hit finish. So we've basically added a part animation. If I hit play, it just will repeat. And since I don't want it to keep repeating, I'm going to click on this circle arrow icon, and then it won't loop anymore. So just one playthrough and it stops. Very good. So the next thing I want to do is maybe do some exploded parts, have this thing disassemble, because that's a pretty common request, and it will give us a lot to work with. So there are, as I mentioned, a number of ways we can do part animations. So let's say instead of going through the animation wizard, we simply want to click on a part and animate it. I can select a part like this thing. I'm going to call it the shark fin, because ever since someone told me it looks like a shark, that's what I'm going to call it. So this is the tower shell. The antenna is inside here. So I can right click on that in the scene tree and see we have the option for animation. From here, we can simply give it an animation. So I can say translate, and immediately I get a bar. And again, it's going to be that default value of 1 in the Y axis. So let's actually just take that value of 1 and set it to something like 50 and hit enter. And where did I do that? If you didn't see the bottom right-hand screen, when you click on an animation, you get access to its properties on the lower right side. And this is where we can go and make changes after the fact. So I like to quickly add my animations, and then I like to go and dial in the settings after the fact. So we have this part kind of exploding upward, and we'll worry about dialing in the exact values we want later. I don't want my entire part to move up so much, because it keeps leaving our frame. So if I go back and click on the initial animation I added, or translation, I'll set this to a lower value. Let's try something like 50 once again. So now we have both of these things happening. What I can do is I can go ahead and copy this and paste it onto other parts. So we see in our scene tree, one thing to consider is that you actually add animations, they get added to the scene tree. So you have these arrows. This is a translation animation. So and it gets added underneath the part that got animated. So if I right click on it and copy it, I can go and select other parts that I wish to paste it onto. So I'm going to hold Control and select more than one part in the real-time view. And you can see that they're both highlighted in the scene tree. If I right click and go down to Material, Animation, I could paste the animation, and then we would get an animation on each of those parts. But I can do something even better than that. And we're going to talk about this. There's a slide later, but paste linked animation will actually move those parts together if we indeed want them to always move together. So I'll click paste linked. If I roll this back, you can see that those parts move together as if they were one piece, because I don't want them becoming separated during that animation. And notice that they're contained within this one green bar. We don't have 3 individual bars here. So at this point, I actually want this whole thing to go up quite a bit further. So I'm going to select that green bar and type in 100. So it moves up quite a bit further, maybe a little further. I'll do 150 for now. Very cool. And then there's some more components in here that I'm going to animate in a little bit. But what we can do to create our animations, if we want things to happen simultaneously, is we can actually change where these animations happen in the timeline. So notice I can click and drag the green bar. And if I overlap these two, you'll notice that if I play them back, they happen simultaneously. If you're wondering why my camera just snapped back to some other view, it's because as I'm moving around in my viewport, and this took me a while to understand, your camera does not automatically update. It always has to be saved. So if you're looking at this side and you want to see how it looks from this view, and you go and hit play, it's going to snap back to where it was last saved. So make sure that if you want to update your angle or view, you either save it before hitting play, or you could just create a new camera. And now it's created from this location. So if I hit play, it won't bounce back. So that's something that can be a little confusing in the beginning and get even more confusing when you start actually animating your cameras. All right, so we got to move on. Let's get into some of the next steps here. All righty. So camera animations. So we can move our cameras, of course, just like our parts. One thing that I have been asked quite a few times, camera animations, again, I could be corrected, but I don't think camera animations can be imported or exported. I know some plugins, and depending on what file formats you're using, will bring cameras from other applications to KeyShot. But as far as I know, actually, the camera animation itself does not get imported or exported within the KeyShot environment. And then lastly, I say limit layering of camera animations. And what I mean by that is instead of creating 5 or 6 layers of camera animations where you're telling the camera to go in a bunch of different directions, at a certain level of complexity, use a path animation instead. And I will explain what that is. But the whole purpose of that is to try not to confuse the program that's trying to execute too many movements of the same object all at once. So that's just a best practice in my mind. So I'm going to go ahead and get back into KeyShot and we'll continue our demo. And now I know I only showed you one basic translation. We're going to spend a little bit of time here doing a couple more part animations as well as some camera animations, and then we'll proceed. But one thing I want to show you here that's quite cool is I talked about local versus global axis. So let's talk about that a little bit. Now, let's say I want to take these screws that are holding together this top panel and animate them moving out, and then this panel as well. So we're going to move toward more of a fully exploded animation. So I'll start by selecting one of these and just right click in the scene tree. This is how I prefer to animate now. And then I'm going to go ahead and do animation and then translation. And I know it's going to go up 1. So I'll type in, we'll do 50, and 50 millimeters brings that up. I'll zoom in, make sure you guys can see that. So our screw is moving up in the Y axis. Now, once again, translate Y. If you're not sure of this X, Y, and Z, this little gimbal or move tool in the bottom left hand of my screen, if you don't see that on your end, it's Z on the keyboard, or Z for those of you in the rest of the world. So the Y-axis is always going up in KeyShot. Z goes forward and backward, and X goes left to right. And that's what we call KeyShot's global axes, and it will never change in KeyShot. Now, you could import models that use a different orientation, different X, Y, and Z, and it still doesn't change KeyShot's global X, Y, and Z. It just depends on when you import a model, what orientation your model will be in once you actually get it into the program. Now, when we look further down here, we have axis orientation, local or global. If I click on local, original local, you'll notice that screw just disappeared. What the heck? Well, if I go ahead and grab that screw, highlight it in the scene tree, you can see the orange outline is showing me that it's now moving in a totally different direction. And that's moving it along that screw's local axis. So the screw's local axis in the Y direction is moving, to our right and left instead of up and down. And that's because it was modeled in a Z up application. So if I changed this to 0 and I set my translate Z to 50, you now see that it goes the direction we want. And again, this can be a little misleading, but if you're the person creating your 3D models, which I personally usually am, I model in an application where it's Y up. But if you're coming in from other CAD applications, you may be used to a Z up orientation or something else. So we can use these local axis and global axes independently, depending on your needs. And for example, if you have one fastener like this that is oriented in different directions on an object, say you have 300 screws and they're all pointing different directions and you simply want them to explode out away from the model, you would use the local axis and type in one value on local axis, and all these screws are going to go in their local original axes instead of one direction. So that does make a very big difference depending on what your purpose is. It can save you a lot of time. So I just wanted to make that clear because that's not a very intuitive function, but it is one that's very handy once you are used to it. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this animation like I did before, right click, copy. And I'm going to select the other screws, which I can see in the scene tree are all named the same. And I will right click and then go to animation and paste linked animation. And now they're all moving up together. Pretty cool. And we'll go ahead and paste that one more time on this piece, the core lid. I'm going to go ahead and right click, animation, paste animation. And I don't want to link it this time because I don't want it to go as far as those do. And also notice it goes now in a different direction. That's because it's got a different local axis. So in this case, I don't want it original local. I'm going to go ahead and set this just to global and set my translate Y to 25 maybe. So it just goes up a little bit, maybe 20. Okay, so you get this idea. Basically, we are adding these little transforms kind of one at a time, and it is a fairly manual process, but it goes very quickly. And the fun thing is once you've built these, you can go and modify them, change how long they take to execute and all the details. So if you want something to move faster or slower, you can simply drag the end of that bar and you can adjust how fast that happens. So if the whole thing is supposed to move up off the ground slow over the duration of all these other explodes, then make sure that this first green bar is lasting at least as long as everything else is. So it's very quick and easy to make updates to those. Now we talked about a camera animation. So let's go ahead and animate our camera. And I'm also seeing this piece go up too high. So let's go ahead and just bring this, where is it? This one down to something like 75 maybe. So now we have what looks to be more like a conventional exploded view. Very cool. Let's say my camera wants to go from the front and do this kind of half matrix thing where it moves around to the back. We're going to go ahead and start by setting up our front view. So to add a camera animation, we want to set our view to whatever we want. And I'll say front, and I'll fine tune the position, something like this, and I'll save it. And now we want to animate this camera, and we're going to go ahead and call this camera orbit, so I know what it is. And now we want to animate it. So we can right click on it and just go down to animation. And once again, sure, we could go through the animation wizard, which is a nice little beginner friendly menu. But to be honest, I know what I want, and I'm going to right click on the camera itself, go down to animation, and we want to do an orbit. So I add the orbit, pretty simple. And it already starts to bring us around, but I want to change the direction it goes, and I want to change how far it goes. So you're going to probably be able to guess, but we're going to simply click on this animation and then go change its settings on the right-hand side in the properties. So I'll go ahead and set my degrees to 180. And maybe I don't want to do a full 180. Maybe I want to do something, let's do 140. And let's go in the negative direction. So there is no counterclockwise or clockwise. I'll just put a minus sign in front and hit enter. And now we're going to go the opposite direction, right around there. So I'm arriving at this kind of 3/4 view, which is quite nice, maybe a little further, 145. Now it's taking too long. So I can either change the duration if I want to get very specific by typing values into the time settings, or I can simply click and drag the duration slider. And I want this to be a pretty snappy, dynamic sort of animation. So probably 2 seconds, maybe even under 2 seconds will be where we end up with it. But I'm going to do something cool because this is a fairly boring movement. This is what we call a linear movement. There's constant rate of speed as this camera moves around the path. And as we get more advanced here and add more stuff, you're going to see on the right-hand side in this geometry view, our camera animations and everything else is, you can watch and track and see how that works, which is nice. So a couple things. Let's say I want to zoom out a little bit because we're getting a little too close to our model. We can do that with adding another camera animation. So my timeline, wherever my timeline is, that's where the camera animation will be created. So I'm going to set that right at 2 seconds. And I want to create a new camera animation. Right click on the camera, then go to animation, and we're going to dolly out. So people use the word zoom a lot when they mean to get closer or further away, but think of zoom as actually changing the viewing plane, so to speak. So you make the object larger or smaller. We actually want to move the camera further away. We're going to use a dolly to do that. Once again, we can shorten the duration, which we can do numerically on the right-hand side for this. Make sure I've got the right one selected. So we can make this down to be the same duration as the orbit. And if we go ahead and try it out, we don't see a huge difference. It's set to 1 again by default. Let's use a negative to move further away. And let's set the value to 50 for millimeters. It looks like I was wrong. Not negative, we'll go positive. That'll pull us further away. So 50, let's try, actually that's looking pretty good, about where I want it. Now you may notice the other thing that happened, and this is going to be one of these finer points. We start with our object centered. And if you ever want guides, you can go into your camera settings and actually turn on a grid. I actually work with my grid up quite often. That shows me the center of the frame. So if I see that this is off and I want to center it, I can simply reposition my camera to really make sure I'm centering certain parts of my image, and then make sure I update it and save it. And now when I play this back, we're looking good, but it's super off center. What if I want to move my object over? You could move the model, but I will always try to keep the model as stationary as possible in my animations. And I try to do almost all of my animations with cameras, believe it or not, because to me, it's easier to manage. If the model's not moving very much, it's easier to, like if you do an exploded view and then you want to do another total different shot where the object moves, you're constantly having to take your model here and either create new model sets or manually go back into the model's position where here and reset it. So just to save yourself some time, something you can do is try to rely on camera animations instead of geometry or part animations. Okay, so that said, we want to reframe or recenter this. There are a couple ways. We can actually move our camera over, so it slides over, or we could change your camera to have a target. So let's try both and see what happens. The first option would be to add another camera animation. Right click, animation, and this time it's going to be a translation. And I'm going to scoot the camera over. So let's bring it to the end. And if I click on my translation and I translate in the, I think, X axis, let's try that. So I'll go to X and I'll type in 50. Perfect. Maybe 40. So that's one way you could handle this. So what's happening is not only is my camera orbiting, but it's moving kind of left to right as it does that to keep my object centered. So, pardon me. Another way we could have done that is actually create a camera target. So what I want to do is turn off this animation temporarily, and I can do that with this checkbox. And let's say I want to actually add a camera target. Well, for my orbit, I don't want to use it for the dolly. So I click on my orbit animation, and you'll notice that there isn't an option for a target unless you're doing a path animation. But what you could do potentially is set a camera target and choose the point or the model or the part. And if I choose to center it on the model, it will take everything in this model into consideration. And we have that long cable that sticks out the back. That would create an axis that is somewhere in the distance behind this, which would not be very useful. So I want to say center it on this part. This guy right here. But notice it now changed my camera location, which maybe I didn't want. And then if I play this back, you will see it stays centered on this piece, but we still have, you know, a bit of an issue centering. So it depends on how you want to approach the problem. I want to go ahead and see if I can Control Z to unset that camera target. Looks like we're good. And then make sure that I have this new translation on as well. So I guess my point is that there are numerous ways you can approach animating or solving problems in KeyShot. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to do it. And sometimes the simplest method is the best by just realizing, oh, maybe you need to change the target of your camera, which, by the way, the target of your camera in the geometry view, this is quite helpful, is represented by this little red star. And you can actually change it by right-clicking on it, move active camera target, and then this can allow you to actually manually move where your camera is pointed as well. If you want to try to reframe your animation a little bit, and then you would just hit the green checkbox, and then you would have to save it here. So that's super helpful. After you've built animations, especially camera animations, I rely on manually adjusting both their targets as well as their paths in the geometry view. We'll get into that more. Okay, so enough on this segment. Let's go ahead and take a look at what else I have in my presentation. So the next part is managing our animations. So we know how to make animations. How do we manage them? What do we mean? Well, linking is one of them, and I did show this already, but we can link animations to move parts that have identical movements. Local axes are honored as well if we link. So what that means is, again, if you have fasteners or screws that are laying horizontally and vertically, but you tell them both to move along their local axis, then they'll both go in the direction of the shaft, you know, which is good. And then lastly, this is a fun little trick that I think you'll like. Link and then unlink to quickly create a waterfall effect. So what the heck do I mean by that? Well, let's get back into KeyShot. Let's see. So these little screws, they move up together in this animation. Oh, and real quickly, notice that we're still on our animated camera. Now it's unsaved. I don't want to accidentally save it and then mess up that animation I made. So it's good practice to, once you've made an animation, you can lock it. I like to go to my free camera, but whether you go to the free camera or lock this one and then go to the free camera, it doesn't really matter. But if you've made an animation in your camera and you don't want to accidentally change it, lock it, and you'll notice it gets removed from our timeline. You only see animations in the timeline of active cameras. Okay. So the waterfall, what the heck is that? So you've seen parts that all move sequentially, and that's pretty cool. I'm going to go ahead and roll this back to where those screws come up, and I want to turn off the other part that explodes. So these screws right here are represented by this one animation right here. And if I go ahead and let's see, got to do it the right way. In the scene tree, I believe is where I have to do it. If we go to these animations, you can see that there is an animation on each one. If I select those, not there, maybe it's down here. Sorry. Maybe I'm forgetting where I did that. Ah, okay. Sorry about that. I knew it was there somewhere. Okay, so it makes sense. If you have a whole bunch of parts that have the same animation and they're all linked, all you have to do is select on one of those animations, right click on it, and then it gives you the option to unlink it. And it will unlink that. If you select the other parts, can we not do it with multiple? Okay. I'll go ahead and unlink this. I might just be blanking, but there should be a way to unlink those all at once. But if there is, and I find it later, I can follow up. So sorry about that if that was anticlimactic. But the point is, once we've unlinked those, if we want to take these and have them all move out, we can take them, put them together. We can shorten them by multi-selecting and then dragging to shorten the time it takes for them to move out. And then we can just pull one out to happen one after the other. So we create the stair step effect. And if that's confusing to look at because there's this animation in the middle, we can actually highlight by holding shift multiple animations and then just drag them on top so they all happen one after the other. And then from here, if we play this, we'll see that they pop up kind of one after the other. And if you wanted them to happen in a different order, so they go like clockwise or counterclockwise, you could do that as well. So once you've done that, the easiest thing that you're going to want to do is put those in a folder. You can highlight them by holding shift, right click, and then add to a folder. And we could call this screw waterfall. And then that gives us a yellow bar with a folder. And if we play that back, same thing. But now what we can do is we can take this and actually adjust the duration so it can happen a lot faster or slower. And why is this cool? Well, when you're in a folder and you scale them all down like this, you don't have space between them. Whereas if I were to move them out of that folder, let's go ahead and put these all together. Oops. We'll move this guy down the others. So if we take them all like this and we scale them down in duration, notice how there's now a space between them. So there are different behaviors, whether your parts are in a folder or not. And when it comes to managing and scaling animations, again, my thought process is work quickly and then spend time dialing everything in. So I'll add this to a folder. And again, what having folders and everything like that allows me to do is move this around as a module or a group, and then speed it up or slow it down based on the direction I'm getting from somebody else or my own preferences. So hopefully that makes sense and that helps. Let's see what else we have here. We're going to get into next was nesting. So that's similar. So putting in folders. We kind of got into this. So nest animations that belong together, like an exploded view. Scaling a folder to adjust the duration of the folder contents, and then keeping our timeline manageable and tidy. So if we get back into KeyShot really quickly, just to hammer that point home, we have our folder here, and that's just the screws. But let's say we want the other parts that move up to be part of a bigger animation. Let's go ahead, or a bigger folder. So this first translation is the whole object moving up. So I want that at the top of my timeline if I can get it there. So I'll try to drag that down below. There we go. I'll set this to be 2 seconds long, and then we have our tower moving up off the ground, and then this other piece moving up. This is a so what we can do is take this piece, and our screws, and then we could put those all together in another folder, and we could call that, explode. And now we have just 2 items to manage. We have the explode, and then we have the whole thing moving up. So let's say we want, instead of the whole thing to move up, you can just turn that off and it doesn't do it anymore. Or we could have it rotate. But remember, we created our camera animation. So let's go ahead and unlock that camera and get back to it, because we're going to do some cool stuff with it next. So going back to this animation, we see everything moves around. Okay. And maybe I want it to go higher up, so it's a little more higher off the ground. And again, this is easy because our initial movement was the whole object translating upward, right? So if we take this guy here and we set it to translate to maybe 75, now the whole item is moving together. We'll do 60. And now our camera, we want that to happen while this whole thing explodes. So we can actually take our camera animation, which is 3 separate animations. Remember, it does the dolly, it does the orbit, and it does the translation to keep our object centered. So I can take these 3 camera movements by holding Control and adding them to a folder, and I can call this dolly 1. And now we have a very simple timeline. We have a camera animation, we have an exploded view, and just the one animation that moves the whole thing up off the ground. And it looks to me we're very low now. So maybe I modified my camera position. If I want that to be higher up once again, let's go ahead and center this guy, make sure I save my camera. And remember too, if we adjust where our camera is starting, it's also going to affect where the camera is ending as well. So if we just move the camera up off the ground a little bit, it means that it's going to end higher up off the ground as well. Just something to think about. Okay, so we got quite a few things going on. What if we want to create more of a dynamic movement with our camera? I think that's what we're going to get into next. So studios. So studios are, while we're talking about kind of managing complexity and tidiness and managing our timeline and everything, studios, much like Tim and Brad showed in their presentation earlier, are a great way to manage everything. So you can imagine on some of the examples I showed earlier, after a while, the timeline starts to get pretty busy. You're managing quite a few cameras. Maybe you're even managing different model sets, pieces of geometry, all that stuff. Studios is a great way to kind of get a handle on all those items. So a camera, a model set, an environment, multi-materials, and an image style can all come together into a studio. And model sets contain part animations, whereas cameras contain camera animations. So use studios like building blocks or sequences. So if I get back into KeyShot, an example of this would be, okay, so we're going to call this our first sequence. It's basically an exploded view with a camera that comes around to look at the backside of our part. Now, I haven't done anything with lights or anything cool like that, but what we can do is go ahead and at least connect our current model set and cameras to a studio. So all we do is go to our Studios tab here, and I create a new studio, and I'll call this S1 for either studio or sequence 1. And I might call this explode rear whip. And I come up with a name that in my mind describes what I'm looking at. So it's a sequence 1, it's going to have an exploded view and the camera's going to whip around to the backside. So we want to make sure that our camera is correct, that we are using the active environment and model sets. We'll just set this to 1 where it is now. And again, materials, if we're not going to bother changing them throughout this animation, we'll just leave it where it's at. So as the animation gets more busy and more complex, we get more and more studios. I may show you the final file that I use to create the animation for this before we're done here. So studios are a great way to do that. Unfortunately, I am keeping an eye on the time. I'm going to try to move this along a little bit. There's a lot I would like to share with you. The next thing is naming. This is often overlooked. It's kind of simple, but I'm not going to dwell on it too long, but keep your naming simple and consistent. Use descriptors. So instead of numbers, it's easier to just describe what it is. And then that way, when you go to name your studios, model sets, cameras, lighting, your names can match up. You can use practical descriptions for those, and it makes it easy and fast to manage your scene. So normally when you create a new camera or something, it's just going to add a new number, or environment. It just adds a new environment plus a number after it. But get specific with your names, and that will help manage your scene when it gets very complex and you've done many iterations. So fine-tuning animations, this is where we get into advanced territory. I'm not going to get too advanced because Ryan's going to do that on Friday, but fine-tuning really means just tightening everything up. So what I've done is a little sloppy. I've showed you just the basics, but now we're going to talk about modifying those settings. One of these things is a camera path. So this is a different type of animation, but it's one that gives you quite a bit of control. And this is where our camera is going to move in 3 axes, so both X, Y, and Z. That means you're going to not just have your camera move from left to right or up to down, but it's going to kind of rotate as it turns, and it's going to move up and down, that type of thing. I suggest using as few points as possible when we create a camera path. It's easy to get carried away. So I use 3 or 4 points usually. And using a camera target will keep your product in the center of the frame. Finally, we can edit points in the geometry view, which we've already talked about a little bit, but we'll come back to that. So here, if I was to add a camera path animation for another sequence, it would look like this. Let's go ahead, and this is where our first sequence is going to leave off. Let's now create a new camera. So by coming to the very end of this, what this is going to do of our timeline, when we create a new camera, it's going to pick up where this one left off. This is crucial because if you want to create a very seamless animation, this is going to help you do it. So I create a new camera and it inherits the settings of the previous camera. Perfect. Now I want to actually animate this camera in a way that is more organic than the first way. So I'm going to call this one path animation, and then right click on this camera, animate, and go down to path. And this little guy pops up. This is going to allow us to add control points and then make changes to it. So we have the option to also do as walkthrough, which is default, or target. So let's start off with this being set to its default walkthrough. And we don't need to add a control point. It's already been captured. This is where the camera's at. So let's go ahead and click and drag where we want the camera to go. So I want to start by looking up at this, and I'm going to add a new control point. And in the geometry view on the right side, you can see we've already added that next camera control point. Now I want to move it around to look at the other 3/4 view. And of course, notice it's creating kind of a straight line between these. So if I wanted this to go up in an arc, I would have had to have added a point at the height of that arc. It's like drawing lines in Illustrator with the pen tool. And then maybe I'm going to, maybe I'm just going to zoom in on it a little bit or dolly in a little closer. And then I'll add my new control point. So we can see our path is looking kind of sharp and jagged here. We'll go ahead and hit OK. But then it smooths out. So KeyShot creates kind of a smooth curve between those. If I play this in the timeline, our camera looks like it had a little too much to drink. Sweet. This is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to using path animations. Yet a lot of the movements you've seen in the animations, whether it's on my demo reel or the animation I showed you earlier, they are often camera animations or path animations, sorry. And what happens is you've got a couple options. You can set a target, or you can manually change the control points. So first off, let's go ahead and try setting a target and see what happens. So if I go and set target, it wants to know what my target is. So I'll click pick. And in the geometry view, I want to pick the most central focal point of my object. And I think that's going to be this piece here. And I'll make sure I say OK. And now let's go ahead and watch that same camera path animation and see if it looks any more stable. Fantastic. I'm not sick after watching that. So that stabilizes it. It's going to basically keep the camera path locked, or the target locked. So let's look in the geometry view. See that red plus? That's our camera target. And as our camera path moves around, it does not move. It stays locked on that point, which is rad. But the problem can be that it looks still a little too like someone's, I say that, it's not always very realistic to have an object stay, like if you're hand holding a camera and you're trying to capture in real life this type of a movement, there's no way you're going to keep it locked perfectly on this focal point. That's impossible. So to make it a little less, to make it just a little bit less perfect, there is a little trick we can do. If we get time, I'll show you that in a little bit. But let's make sure. Oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to show you was, let's say as we're moving along this timeline, we wanted to make a change. Like for example, it gets to this far point, but then I don't want it to come back in so far. Or maybe I don't want it to move quite so far away here. It just seems too weird. Well, in the geometry view, this is where I spend, like I said, quite a bit of my time. These orange cameras represent the control points that we can move. So I'm going to go ahead and click on one and it becomes yellow. Right click it, move control point. And this is cool because at this point, I can move it in space. I can say, I don't want it to come that far. And it updates in real time. And I'm going to pull this back, green check. And then I'm going to do the same for the end control point and move it closer in and a little bit further over here. So we don't have that crazy boomerang effect at the very end. Now, if we play this back, it should look a little bit less bouncy at the very end. Much better. Very cool. Okay, so that is really, again, there's no magic. There's no easy button. I think either Brad or Tim said that earlier, and that's so true. There is a lot of art behind this. There's a lot of trial and error. But what I want to show you is that it's not difficult, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. So you shouldn't be afraid to try it, which is really fun. So let's get into the next item here real quick, and that is going to be one of KeyShot 9's new features, which is custom curves. And this is where you really get to make something pop and add some dynamic awesomeness to it. So custom curves are huge. This is, they call them animation curves. Allows for variable speed at any time, whether this is on a part or a camera. This allows us to make animations more fluid and dynamic. We can also emphasize certain things. We can add weight to movement. If you want to make something look like it's heavy and slamming on a surface, you can do that. You can make something look like it's bouncing. And then we can also copy and paste these custom curves to apply the same finesse to multiple parts, which really saves a lot of time. Let's go ahead and show you how to do that really quick, because this is really one of the coolest things. I've been using this a lot lately. I want to start off by doing this on the whip that we did earlier. So our camera rotation where, once again, if we are in a new camera, we have to go to the previously animated camera in order to edit it. So we have this dolly here. So in our first sequence, we go like this. And let's say I want this camera to kind of whip around fast. I'm going to go into the first item. So the names of them, I can't quite see. So if I hover over and drag to the right, I can now see the names of these animations. I want to use the orbit. Select this. Motion ease is set to linear. If we go to custom, we now have a green line within a chart or a graph, and we can modify it. So let's say I want it to accelerate quickly. So it's going to start slow, it's going to speed up in the middle, and then it's going to slow down toward the end. So it's not so jarring. All you do is grab this box, and I'm going to hold shift and drag down into the right. And this is going to allow me to create an S curve between the starting and ending point. And that right there is how, that's all we have to do. Now, if I play this back, you'll see in real time the effect that has. Much more fluid. Starts slower, ramps up, slows back down. And if this is confusing or new to you, this little properties curve here, see if I can pop this out. I can, okay. So right here, what we're getting is very, very maybe confusing or intimidating if you're new to this. But when you click on a dot, that's one of the points. So that's where our camera's starting, and then it's where it's ending on the upper right-hand corner. The vertical axis is time. Actually, time is across the bottom. The vertical axis is going to be whatever value. So the value means a bunch of different things depending on what you're animating. So I don't want to get too much into that. But the point is, the way you read this is we're not going very far. So this value is percent of travel. So how much of this curve did we go across? So if we're moving up very slowly, but we're going across the timeline at the bottom, the steeper this curve gets, the faster everything moves, basically, is the way you can think of it. So we're moving along it. And if we want it to be really fast, we could make this curve even more aggressive. These handles just need to go further past each other. So now if I play it, it's going to happen very quickly. Nice little speed ramp. And if we don't want it to slow down at the end, we can actually take this other ending handle and move it vertical. And this is going to create like a little speed ramp, and it's going to go faster and then stop abruptly. So these these custom curves are really, really useful. You can also add keys. And when you do that, you get more points. And the crazier this curve gets, the more of an effect it's going to have on your part that's being animated. Really doing a deep dive on these warrants its own presentation. So I cannot spend time going too far into this. And I'm hoping or thinking maybe that the presentation on Friday will touch on these too. But what I will say is we can copy this. So let's copy a curve. And then we could go to one of the other animations, like our path. And if I wanted to, I could paste that. Actually, let's not do it on a camera. Let's actually do it on like the explode. Like for example, the whole thing where the camera, where the whole router moves up, I can select this guy, go down to motion ease and set it to custom, and then right click and then paste curve. And when you use the same curve in the same shot for multiple parts, things are going to move together, which is really quite nice. Adds a lot of dynamics, I guess, because you want contrast between the slow and fast movements. You don't want everything moving at the same pace. Otherwise, that's boring. Okay. So the next thing we've got here is, I said moving targets. So this is going back to the path animation where I had a target. If we need to, we could actually set our target to an animated object, which is a little bit wild, but we can control where the camera gets pointed. So if we get back into here and we have our path animation, this guy's moving, but again, we addressed this. We said, man, how is the camera staying so focused perfectly on this part that's staying in the middle of our frame? It's just not as realistic. Well, if we went to edit, add geometry, and we add a little cube in here, with the green checkbox, where is our cube? There it is. Let's go ahead and move it. And let's actually bring it out a little bit and up a little bit. There we go. So if we go along here, we can take our cube and we can also animate our cube. Let's go ahead and just get it roughly into position. And let's set it in the middle here. We'll just do this off to the side. And now what I want to do is I want to animate this cube. So I can select it and just do a simple translation. And let's just move it in one axis. So this cube is going to move. We'll call it, we'll go in the x-axis like 50, just enough. Maybe we'll do 75, just so you can make sure that you're seeing what this is doing. Make sure it's a big enough difference. And we'll just set that to linear, and that's fine. And I want this animation to last as long as that camera path animation lasts, which is, I think, 5 seconds. Okay. So now what we can do is, if we look at that camera animation, we had a path or a target. That was this object here. We can pick a different target, and we can pick this cube. And we can take that cube and we can make it invisible. Let's just set it to emissive and don't make it visible to anything. Make sure its color is just black and it's not bright. So crazy enough, now if we go and we play this camera animation, it's going to follow that cube. And basically that's why our whole router ends off to the side now, because we're actually tracking and following that cube, which is a way to add a little bit more movement in something while still using the camera target function. So I know that gets a little bit more advanced, but it is something that I felt was worth sharing, because I don't think I've seen a lot of people take advantage of that, and it works surprisingly well. It really helps you art direct something. If somebody's like, yeah, but I just want this to be over here, why can't I move it over here? That's a good way to take advantage of both target and your animation, your path animation. So I think the next thing we had on here was blur, which will be super short. So this is motion blur. This creates these little ghost trails when something is moving fast. We can have camera blur, which is like motion blur, but it has to do with the camera moving instead of the object moving. And then when you enable them, you add realism, but do know it will affect render speed. We're totally not going to talk about importing animations because this is already going a little long. So we'll save that. Again, Ryan will touch on that on Friday, I believe. But in here, this motion blur thing I was telling you about, that's this icon, which is the horizontal, or I guess angled icon with the lines. So when I go ahead and take it and I turn it on, you'll notice that these objects here look blurry. And look at the screws. You can see these ghost trails because it's moving faster than our shutter speed, which is our 30 seconds frames per second. If I change it to 60 frames a second, you'll notice there's less motion blur because the camera's moving. There's more frames per second. It can reduce that blur. If I bring this down to something like 12 frames a second, you'll see there's massive amount of blur and everything gets blurry. So you can control that. Just consider, your frame rate. But the faster the object moves, the more motion blur you're going to have, and that makes things smoother to look at. And when you enable it for the camera, when your camera whips around real fast, remember like we did with this other one in our first sequence, our camera whips around, look at how much blur that is. There's left to right horizontal camera blur. And this is something that really makes things look realistic and much more natural. So if you can afford it, always use your motion blur for both parts and cameras, okay? You'll also see in the geometry view, your camera does a little bit of a dance when you have motion blur on. So if that is obnoxious, just turn it off for the time being, and then you can turn it on before you're ready to render. Cool, I think I'm pretty much at the end here, I believe. We're gonna jump into Q&A, and sorry for anyone who had to drop out early. There will be a recording of this live, so hopefully you guys can take advantage of that. We are at our Q&A, so I'm going to go ahead and let Derek or anyone else on the line throw some questions at me again if there's time. And if I can, I will answer anything you guys throw at me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Will. That was fantastic. I mean, a really great, thorough overview there. Really appreciate that. And I think everyone understands, hey, more content's better, right? So some questions from the audience, and I'll kind of just go in order and try to group some of these up. But one person's mentioning, as you were sort of showing the cable getting plugged in, it's a static cable. Is there anything you can do to kind of get a more dynamic moving cable type look?
That's a great question. So if you want the cable to flex or bend, you're going to have to do that in a software that supports deformation animations. And again, I think on Friday, you'll learn a little bit more about that. But once you've done that, if you can do that in another software, that can be imported to KeyShot through an Alembic file. I did not do that. In the example I showed earlier, all I did was make sure that my camera was close enough to that object that you couldn't really tell or pick up that it wasn't flexing or bending. So I try to be a little strategic about that. The short answer is not in KeyShot or like natively, you're not going to get it to flex. But if you're clever about kind of how it moves, you might be able to nudge it a few degrees here and there to make it look like it's just not moving in a straight arrow path, if that makes sense.
Yeah, great. And then you'd show, I think, on some of your animations, sort of the annotation ability to kind of do call outs on things that are happening. How do you do that?
Any sort of annotations that are needed, I think those have all been done in Premiere Pro for me. So my workflow is create the raw images or image sequences or animations in KeyShot, render those out as frame sequences. So what the heck am I talking about here? In our animation output, you can see here, I never output video format. Honestly, I always have just this checkbox for frames. And what this does is this gives me every single image, 30 of them per second. And then I load those sequences into a video editing application. And that's where I'm doing my final touch. So if you're used to going into Photoshop to do the last little bits of pieces, tweaks here and there, final adjustments, think of my editing program like After Effects or Premiere Pro as being pretty much the same equivalent for video.
Great. Another question is, when someone's doing an animation of a part, is there an easy way to put that part back to its initial location rather than kind of doing the math of where it goes?
And yeah, great question. Love it. There are multiple ways, actually. So first and foremost, this is why I tell people or recommend that people animate everything. And so for example, let's say you're doing a marketing shot and you want an exploded view. Rather than meticulously moving everything to this position for one rendering, if you simply animate it, just drag back to the beginning and you're assembled again, if that makes sense. And that way, if somebody's like, yeah, but I want these parts to be closer together, it's so much easier and faster to, in my opinion, adjust animations, even if you're still just going to render out a still frame of this. Okay, so that's one answer. The other answer is, let's say I didn't do this. Let's say I just straight up moved a part. So I'm going to grab this piece and I'm just going to move it off to the side. And let's say I go, oh crap, I now want it back where it once was. I can go into the position tab for this part and just hit reset. And that will go back to where it was when it was imported. So I want to be clear. It's not, if you move it a whole bunch of times and you just want it to go back to a certain location, that may not work perfectly, but it should at least get you back to where it was imported. And last but not least, let me try this one more time. There may be one third option, which is, let's say this is moved off to the side. Let's say I copy the location of another part that has not been moved. So copy position, and then go to this other part and paste position. That works as well, because it's basing those locations off of the actual center of the bounding box of that part. So even though they're not the same object and they're not technically in the same location, they share the same center point. So that works. So there's 3 ways to do that.
Great. Someone's asking, at one point you could only use one path animation per compiled animation. Has that changed? And do you have best practices for using path?
Yes. Sorry, it took me a while to ingest that.
Yes,
And
I was not clear on it as well.
I think it was a reference to a previous webinar on animation that I did a couple of years ago. And I think at that point, that might have been a piece of advice I offered. In this case, I do multiple path animations and per entire finished animation. So let's get back to this concept of sequences. We made one, which was a studio. Again, sorry, I just, in my head, I call them sequences. But if we go here and I have my, I've got my second path, my second camera animation, which is a path animation. If we go and create a new studio, I would call this one S2 path or whatever, and make sure that my camera is correct and everything else. We didn't get to, oh, you know what's interesting? While I'm on this, I think it's doing this weird thing because I turned off this cube, which is actually a target. Yeah. Let me just, sorry, quick segue. If anyone follows my advice and uses the moving target thing, you can't turn the object off or it won't know what to do with it. So that's why I made it invisible. Okay, so anyway, using these studios to capture different parts of your animation, that's how I manage this. I know once upon a time, I would have used studio switch events or camera switch events, either one. If you prefer that method, that's fine. I just find that I tend to work in segments. And when I go and do a studio, it actually shows all my animation in the timeline for that one sequence, which could be anywhere between 3 seconds and 15 seconds. And then when I'm ready to do my final rendering, it makes it so much easier in the queue to just add all my studios, which basically is my entire animation in smaller chunks. And that's so cool because I can enable with the checkbox, if I say add studios, and and I add both of those, it gives me the option to check them on and off. If I say, oh, I only have enough time to render this one, I can just let this one go, or say I'll render all of them and maybe I'll leave them overnight, that type of thing. So I think the answer to the question was yes, multiple studios per animation, or sorry, multiple camera paths per animation, but I only have, I make sure I manage my whole animation through Studios now. Because back when I did that previous webinar, Studios was not a feature.
Oh, great. Some people are asking kind of what your process is before you kind of start, right? Before you actually start animating, do you storyboard it? What do you kind of do to kind of, like in this case, figure out, what it is you want to create?
Absolutely. I do storyboard. I just have a clipboard with, printed, white paper, and I just bust out the pen and markers, and they're ugly, but they're working. If I'm working with a client, I have to storyboard because we have to come to an agreement before we move forward, because it can be very costly to spend time on something that does not fit what they're thinking. If it's myself, if it's just for me, I don't bother storyboarding. I spend lots of time thinking about this, and I kind of in my mind, I don't think about the challenge of what it would take to create something. I just try to, in my head, picture the thing, how cool it could look. And then I worry about trying to solve those technical problems as I get there. So if it's for me personally, I don't storyboard. If it's for a paying customer, I absolutely storyboard, because we have to be on the same page, and it does save time, and it makes sure your compositions for each shot are better than if you just did it without planning. So very good question.
Can lighting be animated in KeyShot?
Yes, and I was getting a little bit nervous about the time constraint, so I kind of sidestepped that. But let me please show that, because it's something I do all the time.
Yeah.
I almost never render animations with environment lighting. I almost always just use physical lights. So the animation I showed you earlier in that YouTube video I showed, where this one is kind of lit super dramatically and you just have those light silhouettes and stuff. I love doing that. And that's how I work usually. So in this, if you download the file to follow along, you'll have this one, but there's the completed KSP that I suggest you guys look at, that I didn't touch it. It's the full thing. You'll see I have lights here as a model set. So if I move this on over, oops, they're not yet in their own model set, but in the other file they are. So if I turn them on, you'll see in the geometry view, I have 3 lights. So I started by going to edit, add geometry, and I added a plane, which is Control 5. I positioned it and I set it to be a light material. Let's go to our free camera. That shouldn't be, let's go ahead and do this. Okay. Sorry, we're all over the place here. Okay. What we're looking at here is 3 animated, or I guess not animated yet, but 3 planes. And when I zoom all the way out, you can't see them. So I double click on them and make sure that they are visible to camera, and we'll see the plane. Go ahead and turn all 3 of these on. So these are area lights. And if I go and set my environment to black, you'll see that these 3 planes are what I used in the final animation. I didn't use any HDRI lighting. And if I go and take these planes and make them so they're not visible to camera anymore, now we're not risking getting them in the shot, the final shot, but we do want to see them reflected and we do want to see their light. And this makes the whole thing look so much nicer. They just have more natural shadows. So the question was, how do we animate these? There's a couple ways. First of all, because these are planes, physical objects, we can do a simple part animation on them. So if I want to move this plane around the object, I would just right click on it and say animation. And let's just do a simple, rotation. And I'm going to turn off my camera. Actually, our camera's not animated now, so we're okay. I want to show you the light moving around here. So we're going to go ahead and take the other planes and turn them off. So we just have the one plane. And this plane rotation, if I start to drag it, doesn't do what we want. in the real-time view, we can actually see it's kind of twisting over on the right-hand side here. So it's twisting around its central axis. We want it to rotate around our object. So we can click on our rotation. We say 90 is fine. We want it to pivot point around something other than itself. So we can say pivot around an object. So we can click pick, and we want to pick our object. So it has orange outlines, and hit OK. And now as we start to drag this, it goes, oh, it's going underneath. So we want to change its axis. So let's try Y. And Y indeed is going to work, but it's moving the opposite direction I want. So let's try -90. And now it should roll over the front surface. And let's say not 90, let's do 180 because we want to go all the way around. And in a matter of seconds, we've got this super cool dynamic light that wipes across the whole thing. And if you wanted to take it one step further, all you would have to do, let's say we want it to be turned off. Like here, this looks good because we got a nice strong silhouette, which I think is always like, that's a nice shot. But then toward the end, I don't like that it just gets stuck here and it's kind of left. I want it to fade back to black. So that's a super easy thing we can do. We just double click on the plane, and then we can go into its material graph, and then right click and do an animation curve fade. So just like our curves that we adjusted for the speed of the camera, we can do that with this, and we just plug it into the color. I think we can maybe do power as well. Let's do power instead, since it's a little more intuitive. So right now, if we click on the curve fade under animation, we see there's nothing. I'll go ahead and hit zoom to fit. And now it's starting at 0. We want it to start at its full brightness. So I can click on this little dot and type in a value of 3000 lumen. That's where I started. And again, we don't see our green line anymore. Let's click this fit to view. And now we see it's fading out. Well, we actually want it to just fade out at the very, very end. So I'm going to take this guy and drag it vertical here. And I'm going to drag this guy all the way on over. And it's basically going to drop. And if we want it to be almost even faster than that, we could add another point. But I think you get the idea. As we drag along here, we should see that it gets dark, and it's getting dark at the very end. So let's actually make it fade more like this. Looks like it's not moving anymore. We need to make sure it's aligned with, so right here, our curve fade, it got added at a different location. Let's make sure it's lined up with our part animation. We can close our material graph, and now as this rolls around, it fades out. And of course, you got to, play with the timing, make sure it's not too abrupt. But the idea is you can play with the intensity, the color, the location of your lights. As soon as you go into physical lights, you can do almost anything you want. In the demo I showed earlier, these little lights were blinking. Believe it or not, if you look in the KSP that KeyShot is providing for that final animation, these blinking lights were literally just a curve fade like this, but it's got like, I don't know, probably 75 little points up and down that are just modulating the brightness. So yeah, good question. Sorry, long answer, but as far as making really kind of interesting dynamic animations, once I've made all the parts move the way I want them, I go and animate lights, and that's really kind of the icing on the cake, so to speak.
Great, and you actually have a great tutorial on animated blinking lights on your blog, and some folks are asking that, so I will provide that in the Q&A window.
Oh, cool. That's a good idea.
Some other folks are asking, one person's asking, do you use Creo at all on your creation? What tools do you use to create the files that you bring in for your animations?
That's a good question. I've never used Creo, and it has more to do with what's been available to me over the years. I'm sure if an employer offered me that tool, I would have learned it, but I don't. Right now, my modeling is done in Fusion 360. And again, it's just the CAD tool of choice for me. Sometimes it's Blender. I use that for some other things as well. Yeah, if you want to hear more about my CAD creation and the steps that I go into before getting into KeyShot, I am doing a live stream this Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific with Autodesk as well. So you can check my Instagram if you want to see more of that. I'm at Will Gibbons Design. But yeah, I usually use Fusion 360. I use that to set up my scenes. I do that for my 3D modeling. I apply all the material assignments to different faces and bodies ahead of time so that when I get into KeyShot, I have everything optimized and ready to go. And it's also where I make sure that when it comes to animation, my scene tree is organized properly. So managing what parts are nested inside other sub components and sub assemblies and things like that, that is done purposely as well in Fusion 360 to make my job in KeyShot as easy as possible. We talked about things like local axes and stuff. If I modeled in something like Blender or Rhino or 3ds Max, those are layer-based programs, not traditional NURBS-based CAD software. They are not going to have local axes on parts, but anyone who uses CAD like Creo, Inventor, SolidWorks, Fusion 360, those types of softwares, they're going to have local axes on parts and subassemblies. And that is a huge benefit when it comes time to actually animate something in KeyShot. So yeah, kind of long answer there too, but hopefully that gives you ideas.
It has been great. So I'm going to ask you one last question, Will, before we wrap up and do our giveaway here. Some folks are asking, when you're doing animation, do you kind of create a new BIP file to focus just on the animation? Do you kind of use the original one? Kind of how do you sort of keep your different files sort of organized from a animation versus rendering standpoint?
That's a cool question. So if I'm taking a product and I'm rendering it in situation where there needs to be an environment around it or something very unique for that final rendering, I am typically going to use one BIP for that, and then I'm going to go ahead and save a version of I'll do a different KeyShot file for the animation specifically. That said, when it comes time to doing my animations, if they're not very specific, like if they don't have to have like something like this where there's nothing around it, I'm not going to create still images. I like to do just one single BIP or KSP for the whole animation. And then vice versa, if somebody wants to pull stills from that, then I can do that. I also recommend that people just to cover your butts, because things happen, make sure you're backing up your files and saving regularly. I think every day I create a new version. I just save as, and I add like a B, C, D, whatever, V1, V2, V3, just so I have a backlog. And if the worst case scenario, if a file corrupts, I always have, I don't lose more than a day's worth of work, I guess is where I'm going with that. So I think if you have all the assets that you want to in one file to both do animations and still renderings, just keep it in one file. I think you should have as few BIP files as possible. But I only save new versions just to make sure I don't lose work. That's really my only thing there. So yeah.
Oops, sorry, could you hear me there okay? Was I muted? It may have been.
You are muted. You are not now.
My apologies. I took a screen from you there because we're doing our giveaway for the Hero 7 camera. Thank you to the folks at GoPro. Thank you, Will. That was a fantastic presentation, so thorough. Reminder, the Animation Essentials content is on the website, so if you want to pull some stuff down and kind of follow along and watch what he's doing, what Will's doing, please do so. Friday is another animation class at 10 a.m. with Ryan Levy, and then Will will be coming back next week for us with the lighting. And so, yeah, thank you so much, Will, for being here and answering questions. And the one last thing to do is here's give away a camera. Any parting thoughts here, Will, before we give this away?
Not at all, but if anyone has not upgraded to KeyShot 9, I can say that I've been using it on quite a few big projects. Its stability is fantastic. The image adjustments like bloom and denoise And then lastly, those animation curves, those are standout feature favorites of mine that now I cannot live without. So I highly recommend you get upgraded. And again, thanks to you guys for allowing me to share what I've done. And I hope everyone got something out of it. So wherever you are, have a good day and good luck on hopefully winning a camera, guys.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, thank you. So Matt Merritt from Janzi, you are the winner of the GoPro Hero 7. Thank you for coming today. We'll follow up with you directly over email and figure out how to get that prize to you. But thank you, Matt, for coming today. And again, thank you, Will. That wraps up our sessions for today. Come back tomorrow at 10 a.m. as we continue KeyShot World 2020 virtual. Everyone stay safe out there, and we appreciate you stopping by and learn about KeyShot today. Have a great one.